Hi everyone, it's Mr. Cinti here, and thanks for watching. This is going to be part one of a two-part video that I'm calling Darwin's Voyage of Discovery. And so I hope you are able to view both parts of that, and I think it'll be entertaining and I think hopefully educational. So let's get right into that. And so what I want to say about the idea of evolution. There's a lot of people that on the street like to think evolution is a theory. Theory of evolution, this is what it's called. What do you think? Is it a theory? I put a little cartoon here of this is how combines biology and baseball. This is how it's thought that sea creatures came onto the land for the first time. They were trying to retrieve their baseball. I think that it's kind of fun. So is evolution a theory? It's a good question. Of course it is. Of course it's a theory. You thought I was going to maybe say something different. There's a lot of important theories in science. We have Newton's theory of gravity. We have Darwin's theory of natural selection. We have atomic theory. And so when you say theory, not a fact, it's just a theory, not a fact, it sort of sounds like opposing things, when in fact in science, I just wanted to start off with some very important clarifications. This is Charles Darwin over here. When you use the word theory like on the street, and when I say on the street, I really mean like in a colloquial sense. Like somebody might say, oh, I have a theory of why the bus is late, or I have a theory. What they really mean when they're saying something like that is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is sort of an educated guess about why something's happening, sort of the answer to a question before it's sort of the beginning of science. You have like, I think that's happening because, and then you'd want to set up an experiment and sort of test that. And if you gather some data and you look at this, you might actually come up with a conclusion that might lead you to a fact and maybe even answer your question. But in science, it's a little bit different. Science is built on these bigger ideas called theories. And below them are factual evidence. So when we've accumulated fact after fact after fact after fact, we're never really over by doing that. I mean, science is the word it means to know. We're constantly searching for facts. And so when we have something that we're very, very confident about, we deem it to be a theory. And so a theory is a collection of many, many, many facts all pointing to the same outcome. So biological evolution, the fact that populations change, is a central principle in modern biology. It shows how all the facts fit together. It's not that we're iffy on it. And it isn't as if, like, for example, atomic theory, we know everything. Every day we accumulate facts and facts and facts, but we're confident that those facts sort of fit together within the umbrella of a theory. And so evolution is widely accepted in science. There isn't a debate in the field of science, and I think most people would agree with this who have looked at the evidence. And so it's withstood prediction and constant testing by observation of scientists, like even in our own students at our school. So it's widely accepted, and it is a theory, and it provides explanation for some very important observations that we have in biology, why there are so many different kinds of organisms on the earth, and how all of those organisms have descended from a common ancestor like a tree. And so this is most important. It's our unifying principle of biology, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. This was brought to you by not the idea of evolution. The idea that evolution means that organisms or populations have been changing over time. It was not brought forth by Darwin himself. He was not the first person. So if you he brought forth the idea of how evolution occurs, and that is via natural selection. So he thought natural selection was the mechanism of change, and that all organisms descended from a common ancestor. In a different video, I'll talk a little bit about the historical nature of the idea of evolution. It's kind of interesting. But the observation that life has changed was, like as I was just saying, was not new to Charles Darwin. There were some great, Charles Darwin was an Englishman. There were some great French naturalists that observed fossils and noticed that fossils in the past were different than organisms today, and thought that maybe populations of organisms have been changing or evolving. And so Darwin, though, sort of, as I said before, sort of crystallized the mechanism. Now, a fossil, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, a fossil is a preserved trace of a once living organism. It could be a tooth, it could be a bone, it could be something even more substantial if the organism died, for example, in a frozen environment or in a tar pit. But it's a trace of once living organism. And we like to find fossils, and this is a picture of the Grand Canyon. We like to find fossils in sedimentary rock. In other words, this was all under the ocean a long, long time ago. And the Colorado River has cut out this canyon, and we can see the strata and layers of sediment that have been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years. It's quite impressive. And so what's fascinating about the fossils, without going into a lot of detail, is fish fossils are found generally lower in the sediment, and that predates land vertebrates and amphibians, which followed next, then followed by reptiles, then followed by mammals and birds. And on the very top, we see the first traces of human skeletal remains. Now, we say skeleton, bones, and teeth and things because the soft tissues usually break down by bacteria and fungi, so the hard parts are usually what remain in fossils. So we see that there's been a succession over millions of years. In other words, humans don't appear on the earth until just recently. Other mammals don't appear on the earth until very recent. Fish are the oldest ones. And so the fact that, and I don't mean to sound sort of rude about this, but the fact that to contrast that all species were individually created at the exact same time doesn't make sense, because there's no evidence of that. It's not what paleontologists actually observe. Paleontologist is a scientist that studies fossils and evolution. What we see is that the fossil record shows that there's a sort of an appearance of these things over a long period of time, and there's an evolution, if you will. And so a Darwinian, and this is sort of Charles Darwin, a Darwinian view of life predicts there should be traces of these changes left in the fossil record, and we see that. We're going to get more into the evidence of this change in a separate video. There's so much to talk about. It's just the beginning of the discovery. But we can see here, I just want to tantalize you with this. We can see that this is a artist's rendition of fossil of something that was a swimming organism that was found in the ocean, and it was a mammal. But what's interesting about this swimming organism, if you look closely at its fin here in the back, it has very similar bone structure than that of a land or terrestrial organism. So we believe that its ancestor was once living on the land. You notice here it has carpals and phalanges, and it has a radius and ulna and a humerus. And so we have bones inside of a fin similar to that of, for example, an arm or a leg. So a walking kind of bone structure. So we also have interesting things that we can find. For example, this is an ancestor again of a modern day whale, but whales even today have these two little bones right here in their back, which are pelvic bones. Pelvic bones are bones that help a land organism from walking. And so what's fascinating is the environment is variable on the earth. It's changed over thousands and millions of years, and so it varies both in time and in space. And so traits that were once important in the past may not be important today. And so there's pressures on those organisms. If they have something that's successful, a trait, then they might leave more children. If they have something, for example, like pelvic bones, and that slowed that whale from swimming. Maybe those organisms didn't survive, and the ones with smaller pelvic bones did survive. More on that later. But here you can see sort of a transition in skeleton right here from what we think was once the ancestor of a whale to something like this, to something like this. And you can see how the pelvic is pretty small at this point. And this is what we see today in a recent whale ancestor. So what is interesting about Charles Darwin, so many things, but he was certainly interested in fossils. He was very interested in digging them up and buying them from individuals that had already collected them. And he was pretty sure that those fossils indicated that organisms have been changing on the earth and that things weren't all created at the exact same time. So a little bit about his life. Charles Darwin, born in 1809, then died in 1886, was an Englishman. And what I want to say about him is that he was born to a pretty wealthy family. His father was a medical doctor, a physician. And so back in this time, it was sort of assumed that Charles Darwin would be a doctor, medical doctor, just like his father. His father really had a strong influence on him. And so though he was interested in just nature as a boy, and he had really interested in beetles and being outside and sort of exploring things, his father pretty much sent him to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. And at this time, in the early 1800s, medicine was pretty crude. It was anesthesiology hadn't really developed, and surgery was pretty brutal. There was a lot of pain and agony, and so Charles Darwin, as the story goes, didn't really appreciate the things that he was learning in medical school, and he kind of was faint at the sight of blood, and he had sort of digestive tract issues, and he just really was turned off by medicine in general. But out of respect, he sort of pursued this because of his father's intention. But after a while, he knew that he couldn't maintain that anymore, and so kind of his father was thinking that the only thing that would remain respectful if Charles wasn't going to follow in his father's footstep, maybe the fact that he had a calling, he had a vocation to become a priest, that would have sort of alleviated public, I don't know what the word would be, skepticism about the Darwin family, that Charles Darwin wasn't going to be a doctor. But if he told everyone that he was going to be a priest, I guess people would roll with it. And so he left the University of Edinburgh without his degree, and then he enrolled at Christ's College at Cambridge with the intent to become a clergyman. And of course, you may know that didn't work out. And so, as it turns out, a naturalist, you can't really call them necessarily scientists per se, but naturalists and scientists sort of belonged to the whole religious clergy anyway. In other words, everyone was pretty clear the fact that all life on the planet Earth was created at one time by God, because that's what the Bible said. And so Charles Darwin was sort of raised with that belief as well, and he had no reason to question it as a youth. And so as it turns out, when he was in school, he also realized that he probably shouldn't pursue the priesthood if his heart wasn't in it. And so he went on some long walks with some professors at Christ College, and they said, Charles, you've got to get out of the influence of your father. And so, as it turns out, he received his degree in 1831, and a professor at Christ College said that recommended Charles to go out on this boat. There was a boat that was leaving England, and it was going on this big journey around the world in 5 years. And the captain of the ship was kind of a young guy, also a first-class citizen like Charles was, a pretty wealthy captain. And the captain was looking for a naturalist and also basically a dinner companion, because the sailors on board these ships at this time in the 1800s were pretty rowdy group, and the captain needed someone that was intellectual that he could sort of chat with. And so Charles Darwin was suggested to be on this ship, even though he didn't have very many skills as a naturalist. But he was accepted by Captain FitzRoy to go on this survey ship called the Beagle. Her Majesty's vessel, the Beagle. And so this ship was intended to go around the world. And again, Charles Darwin was chosen because he was educated, he was first class, and he was of similar age to Captain FitzRoy. And so the intention was to leave England, travel south to South America over here in Brazil, and basically go along and survey. It was a survey ship to go along and to make maps. England was always interested in making maps so that its ships would know where it's going. And so Charles Darwin was on board, and his idea was to come onto land, collect specimens, make observations, go around the Cape, come over here in the high mountains of the Andes, and then over here in Ecuador, the ship traveled in a westerly direction in the Pacific Ocean to the famous group of volcanic islands, a chain of islands, archipelago it's called the Galapagos Islands. And that's his famous stop. He spent about a month there. And then he left the Galapagos Islands and then traveled around over here and then back to England, 5 years around the world, collecting specimens. And on board, you imagine like when you go on a plane trip just for a couple of hours, you usually bring a book or your iPad and you do a little reading. Well, Charles Darwin, it said, brought only a few books, one of them being the Holy Bible. Another one he brought was Lyell, Principles of Geology. This is a picture of Lyell. And he was reading about geology. And it turns out that Charles Darwin's knowledge of geology served him well because on his trip around the world he was able to see things. He knew that mountains, for example, must have taken years and years to uplift. And he knew that valleys oftentimes could be created by rivers. And he knew that the Galapagos Islands were volcanic. These are the tips of volcanoes. And as the lava comes and spews over, it forms solid rock, and there's islands. And so he knew from his readings and his observations that the church's position of the earth just being a few thousand years old wasn't quite right, and according to actual evidence of geologists in the day. And so that's really important. He was more open to the fact that the earth was a dynamic, changing place. And so he knew the earth was capable of change over a long period of time. And I think that led him to be more open to the fact that populations of organisms can change over time as well, and that they're not fixed. In other words, they came in, they were created in one fell swoop, and they've never changed since. So he was open to geology. And so on his journey, one of his famous animals that he found in South America, I don't know if you recognize this, is an armadillo. He loved the armadillo. He not only collected them, he found fossils of armadillos from the past. Members of the ship would actually just get these armadillos and actually hunt them down and eat them. And we know this because he has really good journal, like the Voyage of the Beagle journal. And so he used to say that they taste like chicken. And so on his journey, he was struck by what he wrote, a succession of types. You remember that ecological succession, like change, a replacement over time, like the king succeeds or a successor. In other words, the modern day armadillo, he thought, replaced what he found as a fossil of an armadillo that was huge, like a giant armadillo, massive. We have fossils of this. He thought that they replaced the giant one, though he didn't know why. And he also found evidence of, here's a modern day sloth or sloth that lives in the tropics. It's very slow moving sloth. He found evidence of giant sloths, and he didn't know what to make of it, but he knew that there was something to this. He knew that if a small modern day sloth was living in the same range or area that a large one used to live that is now extinct, maybe there was something to this. And literally a quote from his book, this wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living, I do not doubt throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on Earth and the disappearance from it than any other class of fact. So he knew there was something up with that. Also, in addition to his knowledge of geology, Charles Darwin was heavily influenced by artificial selection. I want to just point this out a little bit. Artificial selection, you might be aware of this, is where modern day, like for example, if you look at cabbage or cauliflower or broccoli or sprouts or kale, did you know that all of these are descended from sort of a common mustard plant, that we've bred certain traits and characteristics and kept others down? We've been domesticating, look at this, this is an old cave drawing. We've been domesticating and selecting farm animals and cattle and horses for thousands of years. In other words, we want horses that are very fast, we want cows that are very large to produce lots of milk, and we will only allow those to breed, and we call that artificial selection. And so he was very familiar with this. He was very familiar with artificial selection of plants. He was also familiar with artificial selection of dogs, like in dog breeding. And so all of these varieties have been bred from this wild mustard. And so what's interesting about it is he asked another question. If artificial selection can achieve all of these sort of interesting varieties in a short amount of time, what can nature do? If nature was going to select variations in a population that help an organism survive. And so this is where he was coming from when, and again, I'm not going to go too far with natural selection in this video, but I'll talk about it in a later video, part 2 of Darwin's Voyage of Discovery. And this is where he comes up with the idea of natural selection. And he decided on his own, in his own backyard, he decided to raise pigeons. And so he was looking for these weird characteristics, and he bred them in a certain way in order to get weird characteristics. And so he thought, boy, if humans can do this artificially, what can nature do given hundreds of millions of years and thousands of generations? And so one of the things is, I mentioned that he traveled to Brazil, the Beagle did, and he also toured these jungles in the Brazilian tropical rainforest, but he also came around to Peru on the other side, and he didn't go all the way to the top of the Andes, but he did have like some packs that helped him move along, and he traveled up into the foothills of the Andes. And when he was traveling up into these mountains, he noticed like interesting fossils. It's like, well, what's interesting about the fossils? He discovered some of the fossils back here in the Andes were marine fossils. These were shellfish. And so, wow, that must mean that these Andes were once underwater long time ago. And then through uplifting, mountains were formed. That's a big deal. He brought these back to England with him on the ship, and he was trying to explain this to the various zoologists in London and the Linnaean Society. He was trying to show them that, look at these marine shells. This must mean that the earth is incredibly old and that the earth has been changing. Look at this evidence. And so people were like sort of taken aback by it. It's sort of suggesting that maybe this is something contrary to the idea that everyone completely accepted, which is the idea that all organisms are the same and they've never changed. Why would they? God created them perfect. So he was suggesting that not only the earth was changing, but something weird was happening with the fossils. And then again, his journey led him to these volcanic islands, which are west in the Pacific, west of the country of Ecuador. And these are called the Galapagos Islands. And when he viewed the Galapagos Islands, he found plants and animals on the Galapagos Islands that were very puzzling. You're like, well, what's puzzling about an animal? Well, this is what's puzzling. If these are volcanic islands, okay, let me see if I can illustrate this. If these are volcanic islands out here, they came from under the sea. In other words, when the rocks became hard, there is no life whatsoever on these islands. This is an example of what we'd call primary succession. There's nothing living there. So anything living today on the Galapagos Islands, or even back in Charles Darwin's time, needed to emigrate there. In other words, organisms needed to travel there. And the organisms we see today are descendants of those original colonists. But what's puzzling about this is that Charles Darwin noticed some very, very strange organisms. This is a blue-footed booby. And when he was back, not that he studied every single animal or plant or bird, but he saw no evidence of these animals over here in Central America and also in South America. And so it appeared that these organisms came about after the Galapagos Islands formed. So in other words, birds came over to the Galapagos Islands and change occurred. Not all created at the same time, because he didn't see any of these in South America. He saw lizards. Now lizards, most lizards don't swim. He saw lizards called the marine iguana that actually go into the water. And they had these dark colorations and they looked really weird and they had these big claws. And he's like, wow, I've never seen anything like that in South America. This must be a unique species. Now, how do you account for that? In other words, how can organisms arrive onto an island from South America to the Galapagos and then change? Wow, puzzling. He noticed all different kinds of birds on the Galapagos. This is called a finch. He wasn't really a specialist in any of these things. He didn't even know that there were different kinds of finches. He thought there were blackbirds and mockingbirds and things. But he noticed that they were different on each island. And as it turns out, when he collected these and brought them back to England, a bird specialist was saying, geez, Charles, you have many different kinds of finches. These are all different species living on different islands. But when you trace it back to South America, there was really only one kind of finch. And then he saw really interesting giant tortoises. They were walking around, and depending on different islands, the tortoises had different shells. And they ate different things. They were different species. And then he saw like really, really strange birds. This is a cormorant. Now, cormorants fly normally, but these ones had really tiny, reduced wings. They don't even fly. This bird is incapable of flying. So obviously its ancestors flew to the Galapagos Islands, and something happened to them over thousands of years. Now they actually swim. And so more about this, like what happened? Why did their wings become reduced? And so when he returned to Great Britain at 1836, and he was just a young man in his 20s at this time, he started to collect, both mentally and physically, all of these facts about these birds and about the cormorant, and the fact that some of these finches eat cactus, and some of them eat seeds, and some of them eat insects. And do you notice their beaks are somewhat specialized in terms of, like this one's really good for eating cactus, this one's got a big, thick beak for cracking seeds, this one's got like kind of a pokey beak for eating insects off of trees. And when you look at the different environments, it makes sense because these different islands have different foods, and you would want a different kind of beak on each of these islands in order to be successful in terms of a trait. And so as it turns out, there's 13 separate species of finch living on those Galapagos Islands, and it was believed that they're descendant from the common ground finch in Ecuador, and that all this change occurred not in the beginning of the earth, not when God created, like, according to the Bible, God created all of these things. But in fact, the evidence suggests that when those islands formed, there was nothing on them. This bird flew to the Galapagos Islands, and its descendants changed into all these different species. Again, more on that later. But Charles Darwin in the early 1840s was starting to develop this idea that natural selection could be the mechanism that causes evolution. And so he was compelled to write down his journal notes, and he even wrote a long essay sort of describing this, but he was reluctant to publish it because can you imagine like writing something that would be absolutely contradictory to the idea of creationism? Do you know how controversial that would be? He would be vilified. He would be scorned, and he would be outcast. And his wife, as it turns out, was a practicing Catholic. He himself was religious, and so he was reluctant to publish something like this. His reputation, his family's name was at stake. So he just continued to sort of stay at home a little bit and compile more and more ideas. And as it turns out, he received a letter in the mail, a manuscript from a young naturalist who was studying similar things in the East Indies. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And as it turns out, Alfred Wallace proposed this idea of natural selection. And when Charles Darwin read it, he was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. Even though I've been studying and compiling this theory over my entire life, Alfred Russel Wallace has basically the same idea. And so I wouldn't dare publish something when people would think that I copied his idea. And so as it turns out, the dates are kind of, trivial, but they're also kind of interesting. So in the summer of 1858, so later in the year, as it turns out, Charles Darwin communicated with Wallace and said, well, let's sort of write a joint paper. And they presented this together. And then the following year, it's a very famous thing, I'm going to write it out, very famous, in 1859, Charles Darwin published his book. So he unleashed all of this information about natural selection in a book called The Origin of Species. And so as it turns out, when we give credit for the idea of natural selection, the theory of natural selection, we should give credit to Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace because they both developed the idea of natural selection, and they developed it separately and independently. But Darwin usually gets most of the credit because his ideas were supported through a lot of research, and he'd been working on it for a long period of time. And so for the next video on the part 2 is going to be a look at his idea of natural selection. So I hope you enjoyed this first part on Darwin's voyage of discovery. Thank you.